What happens when a father witnesses his son being killed in cold blood? How far will one man go to demand justice when the system fails him? In a peaceful neighborhood, an unexpected tragedy sparks a battle against police violence and corruption. Will the truth be enough to bring justice? Watch the full story to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, golden hue over the quiet suburban streets of Houston, Texas. The air was warm, a typical spring evening that seemed to promise nothing but peace and serenity. In a neatly kept rental house tucked away on a calm cul-de-sac, Kevin Martinez and his son Marcus were settling in for a long overdue celebration. The dining room smelled of grilled steak and roasted vegetables, the kind of feast that marked an important milestone. Marcus had just graduated from college, and this dinner was meant to honor that achievement, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Kevin watched his son across the table, his pride evident in the smile that tugged at the corners of his lips. Marcus, with his broad smile and bright eyes, looked every bit the young man ready to take on the world. A future in medicine awaited him, a career that would see him healing others, a stark contrast to the dangerous life Kevin had lived as a soldier. "So, what's next for Dr. Martinez?" Kevin asked with a chuckle, lifting his glass to toast his son. Marcus laughed, the warmth in his voice filling the room. "Well, first, I think I'll take a week to breathe before I dive into the real world, but I'm excited to get started, Dad." The sound of laughter echoed in the room, the weight of years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and the relentless pursuit of his degree all finally paying off. Kevin felt a deep, unshakable pride for his son, a pride that was shared by both men in this quiet moment, in this space far from the battles Kevin had fought in distant lands. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful, with houses lined in neat rows, their front porches glowing with soft lantern light. The crickets sang their evening song, and the trees swayed gently in the cool breeze. Everything seemed perfect, as if the world itself was pausing to celebrate Marcus's success. But the tranquility would not last. Across the street, a woman peeked out from behind her curtains, eyeing the unfamiliar face of Kevin as he walked toward the rental car parked in the driveway. She picked up the phone, dialing a number, her voice low as she spoke into the receiver. "Yes, I don't know, it just looks suspicious." "He's standing by the car, looking around like he's checking if anyone's watching. I don't think he lives here." She paused, her fingers tightening around the phone's receiver. "I'll stay inside." Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the quiet street. Unbeknownst to Kevin and Marcus, the chain of events was already in motion. Kevin stepped outside into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the day's celebration slowly settle into his bones. It had been a perfect evening, dinner with his son, laughter filling the house, and the quiet pride of watching Marcus achieve something monumental. Marcus had graduated from medical school, and Kevin was determined to mark this moment with a special gift. He walked toward the car parked in the driveway, eager to surprise his son. Inside, Marcus sat at the dining table, finishing his meal. The warmth of the evening still lingered in the air, and he felt content in the quiet moments. He had worked so hard to reach this milestone, and tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Across the street, however, the scene was starting to take a turn. A neighbor, curious and suspicious, peeked out from behind her blinds. She saw Kevin standing near the car, his body relaxed, unaware of the watchful eye on him. With a furrowed brow, she picked up the phone, dialing 911. "Yes, I don't know. There's a man standing near a car looking around. He looks suspicious. I don't think he lives here," she whispered into the phone, her voice filled with unease. The sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as they approached the peaceful suburban street. Kevin, oblivious to what was unfolding, reached for the car door and retrieved the small wrapped box. It was a simple gift, but it carried so much weight, years of sacrifice, pride, and a father's love. As he turned back toward the house, he was unaware of the flashing lights approaching from the distance. Meanwhile, Marcus stood up from the table, noticing the lights reflecting through the window. Confused, he looked outside and saw the squad cars pulling up. "What's going on?" he muttered, but before he could gather his thoughts, there was a knock at the door. "This is the police." "Step outside with your hands where we can see them," came a sharp, authoritative voice from beyond the door. Kevin opened the door cautiously and stepped outside onto the porch. Marcus followed him, still unsure of what was happening. The 4 officers stood near their squad cars, hands resting just inches from their weapons, their eyes scanning the scene with suspicion. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this residence," the lead officer said. "You need to identify yourselves." Kevin's frustration surged. This wasn't right. He had been in combat zones, faced danger overseas, but here, in a rented house celebrating his son's success, he was being treated as a threat. "This is our house. We rented it. My son just graduated and we're celebrating. Is that a crime now?" The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting between Kevin and Marcus. Kevin's fists clenched, the injustice of it all sinking in. He had spent years serving this country, and this was how he was treated. Darnell, trying to calm things down, spoke up. "We don't want any trouble. We can clear this up. I'll show you the booking confirmation." His voice was steady, but his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. Just as Marcus reached for his phone, everything escalated. The officer's voice shot out, "Don't move, hands up." Panic gripped the air, and before anyone could react, a shot rang out. Kevin stood firm, his body taut with frustration and confusion. His patience, built through years of military discipline, was wearing thin. These officers had crossed a line, treating him and Marcus like criminals without a single reason. "We've told you everything," Kevin said, voice low but resolute. "We're not a threat. This is our home, our celebration. What more do you want?" The officers remained silent, their eyes moving back and forth between Kevin and Marcus. The tension in the air thickened as the officers continued to press, ignoring their explanations. The entire situation had escalated far beyond reason. Harris, the lead officer, spoke again, his tone cold and commanding. "We're not going to ask again. Step outside and cooperate," he ordered, his hand hovering near his gun, a move that sent a chill down Kevin's spine. Marcus, though clearly frustrated, tried to remain calm. He glanced at Kevin, then addressed the officers. "Dad, maybe we should just show them the rental confirmation. It'll clear things up," he suggested, reaching into his pocket for his phone. Kevin's stomach sank as he saw Marcus make the move. It was a simple gesture, one meant to de-escalate the situation, but in that moment it became a trigger. He tried to make eye contact with his son, hoping Marcus would see the danger, but it was too late. Without warning, Officer Taylor, the younger officer standing closest to Marcus, misinterpreted the action. "Don't move," he yelled, voice sharp and panicked. In that split second, Taylor's finger was on the trigger. He saw Marcus's hand moving toward his phone, and out of fear and assumption, he fired. The deafening crack of the gunshot sliced through the night. Kevin's heart froze as he watched Marcus stagger back, his body jerking as the bullet hit him. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief and pain, and before Kevin could even process what was happening, his son collapsed to the ground. "Marcus!" Kevin screamed, falling to his knees beside him. His hands reached out, trembling as he cradled Marcus's body. The warmth of blood soaked into his clothes as he tried desperately to stop the bleeding, but it was already too late. "Please, Marcus, stay with me," Kevin pleaded, his voice raw, but Marcus's face was already paling. His son's breathing came in quick, shallow bursts, his eyes locked with Kevin's, wide with confusion and horror. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. Kevin's hands shook uncontrollably as they pressed against his son's chest, trying in vain to save him. "Please, son, hold on," Kevin whispered, but the life was draining from Marcus far too fast. With each passing moment, Marcus's grip loosened, his body slipping further away from him. Kevin's chest tightened, his world spiraling into darkness. His son, his pride and joy, was dying in his arms, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marcus's breath hitched one last time, then stopped altogether. His hand twitched weakly before going completely limp. Kevin felt the life drain out of him, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. "No, no," Kevin's voice cracked, the word barely escaping him as his mind tried to process the horror unfolding. His son, the boy he had raised with so much hope, was gone. Around them, the officers had begun shouting, but their voices felt muffled to Kevin. The world around him had ceased to exist. His focus was entirely on the lifeless body in his arms, the blood that soaked through his hands, the emptiness growing inside him. The sirens grew louder, but Kevin didn't care. His thoughts were consumed by the terrible, irreversible loss of Marcus. The injustice was suffocating, and there was no way to undo what had been done. The officers, still standing off to the side, seemed to realize the magnitude of what had just happened, but they remained silent. Kevin could feel their eyes on him, but it didn't matter. His son was gone, and no amount of apologies or explanations could bring him back. In that moment, Kevin felt the weight of the world press down on him. His body trembled from the loss, but his mind was already set. They would answer for this. The officers had taken his son, but Kevin would not let them walk away from this. His grief was just beginning to fuel a fire for justice that would burn brighter than the pain. Kevin knelt beside his son's lifeless body, hands trembling as the weight of the tragedy sank in. His son Marcus, gone in an instant, and the system that was supposed to protect him had taken him away without reason. The sirens blared outside, but the world around him felt still, muted, as he held his son's body in his arms. But as the numbness of loss threatened to overtake him, something else started to stir within Kevin. It wasn't just grief, though that was heavy and unbearable. It was something deeper, a growing fury, a sense of injustice that went beyond the personal loss he had suffered. Kevin had fought for this country, fought for freedom, and yet here he was, standing on the soil he had bled for, with nothing but the hollow shell of his son in his arms. Kevin's military training kicked in. He had been trained for battle, for survival, for moments like this. And though his son was gone, Kevin's fight had just begun. He knew that he had a responsibility now, not just to his son, but to everyone who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. The police had murdered his son, and no matter how hard they tried to sweep it under the rug, he wouldn't let them get away with it. "Don't just stand there," Kevin said, his voice hoarse but sharp. "I want you to understand what you've done. You've taken my son's life, and now you'll answer for it." The officers, still standing at a distance, exchanged looks, but no one moved forward. Kevin's words had struck a nerve. They knew they couldn't ignore him anymore. His pain, his anger, was an unspoken declaration that this would not be buried. It wasn't just Kevin's grief anymore. The injustice that had been done to Marcus was now public. The media, once reluctant, began to pick up the story. The image of a father cradling his dead son in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood became a symbol of something much larger, of years of systemic injustice, of lives unjustly taken by those in power. Marcus's name spread quickly across social media, newspapers, and news stations, turning his death into a battle cry for justice. The tragedy quickly turned into a movement. People from all over Houston took to the streets, rallying for justice for Marcus. They carried signs bearing his face, chanted his name, and demanded that the officers responsible be held accountable. The protests grew larger, their voices louder, reaching far beyond the city of Houston. It wasn't just Marcus's story anymore. It was the story of every person who had been wronged by the police, by a system that had turned a blind eye to their suffering. And the calls for justice had finally found a voice. Kevin, still grieving, now found himself at the forefront of this growing movement. He hadn't planned for this, he hadn't asked to be a leader. But when he spoke, people listened. He wasn't just a father who had lost his son, he was the embodiment of a nation's outrage. And people stood with him. Protesters, activists, and citizens came together, uniting under one common cause, the fight for justice. The demonstrations spread beyond Houston. Across the nation, people were standing up, marching, raising their voices in defiance of the status quo. No longer were they willing to accept the violence and brutality they had seen time and time again. They were demanding accountability. They were demanding change. Kevin's pain, his anger, had ignited something much larger than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a call for justice for Marcus. It was a call for justice for all, for an end to police brutality, for a system that could no longer operate without consequences. Kevin knew this was just the beginning, and he was ready to fight. Though his heart was heavy with loss, Kevin realized that this movement had the power to change things. The people who marched in the streets, the ones who shared Marcus's story, had created a tidal wave of resistance that couldn't be ignored. Kevin's fight, however personal it started, had now become a fight for every person who had been silenced for too long. As the protests gained momentum, Kevin couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility. His son's death wasn't in vain. Marcus had become a symbol for a generation that had endured too much. Kevin vowed to make sure that, in the end, justice would be served. He wouldn't let his son's death be forgotten or swept away. The movement was just beginning, and Kevin would lead it, for Marcus, for every victim, and for the future. The courtroom was tense as Kevin sat at the plaintiff's table, feeling the weight of the battle he had fought. Officers Taylor and his colleagues stood at the defense table, their faces hard but betraying the pressure they were under. The video footage of Marcus's shooting, along with witness testimonies, painted a clear picture of the unjustified killing. The jury deliberated briefly, before returning with a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. The officers were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kevin's heart was heavy. There was no joy in the verdict. Marcus was still gone, but the officers were finally held accountable for their actions. Outside, the streets were alive with cheers and chants of Marcus's name. The victory in court was a powerful moment, but the movement had only just begun. The community now focused on reforming the justice system and demanding changes within law enforcement to prevent future tragedies. The fight for justice was no longer just about Marcus. It was about all victims of police violence. The movement grew, pushing for changes such as better training, greater oversight, and an end to systemic racism in policing. Kevin stood at the forefront of this change, his grief now a fuel for the ongoing battle. The fight for justice wasn't over, but with each step forward, the dream of a fairer, more just society seemed closer. The story of Kevin and Marcus is a powerful reminder that justice must be fought for, especially when it comes to the victims of police violence and systemic racism. Marcus's tragic death became a rallying point, not just for his family, but for a broader movement that sought to challenge a system that had long failed so many. Kevin, in his grief and determination, stood as a symbol for those who had been silenced by injustice, those who never had a chance to fight back. This battle was not one fought alone. The strength of the community became evident as people from all walks of life united for the cause. What started as Kevin's personal fight for justice quickly turned into a collective struggle. When people stand together, their voices become impossible to ignore, and together, they can push back against the systems that perpetuate inequality and abuse of power. The people's unity was key in bringing about change, showing the power of a collective that could no longer be silenced. The story also reveals a critical shift in the mentality of law enforcement and the justice system. Though long resistant to change, this case showed that the system is capable of holding police officers accountable for their actions. The conviction of Officers Taylor and his colleagues was a step in the right direction, and it signaled a new possibility: that change is achievable. Kevin's relentless pursuit of justice, along with the unity of the community, proved that when people refuse to accept injustice, they can bring about the change they deserve. The fight for justice continues, but the story concludes with the hope that the system can finally be held accountable, and justice can be truly served.